Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and today this is, as far as I'm aware at least, the final book of the Dame Frevisse series, and in a break from tradition, is entitled Winter Heart. Now, in this novella, we get another story of Dame Frevisse as the prioress of St. Frevisse, so Domina Frevisse. And, for the record, as per usual, I'm not going to worry about spoilers, so if anybody wants to read this without being spoiled, you should probably go read it and then come back. I don't always say, even though I ought to, this is an all-spoiler zone. I don't like playing the game of talking around what happens in a book, because, then how do you really talk about a book properly? Anyways, so in this one, we get, like I said, we get a story of Dame Frevisse, and there isn't much about her being the prioress, except that, of course, at the beginning of the book, she is, dealing with accounts, and the thing is that, the advantages of being prioress, of being in charge, and there are always advantages to being in charge, or most of the time, you get privileges for it. And the prioress gets to have a room to herself, she gets to have a fire going all the time, she gets to do all kinds of things, and Frevisse is contemplating the fact that given her situation, given what she's doing, given how still she has to sit and a whole bunch of other things, she needs that fire because she needs to be able to keep writing. If she's doing accounts, she needs her ink not to freeze in the ink bottle. She needs to have her fingers continue to be able to write, which, if your fingers are feeling stiff from cold, is something that is very, very difficult. And so she contemplates, various things to do with that, but also the fact that she had wondered at one time how it was that Domina Elizabeth had always been so calm in the face of trials and travails, and she says to herself, she considers that when you are faced with a crisis where everyone else is panicking or freaking out, that somebody's got to stay calm, and I think it mostly reads that when you are aware that there's going to be something upsetting, and everyone else is already upset, that it can be easier to keep yourself calm because going into it and arriving from the outside that such is possible. Anyway, so that's one bit of discussion going on, but the main mystery is interesting in that it starts off with a man telling a story that sounds crazy, and it sounds stupid. It sounds like a dog ate my homework kind of excuse. I was out doing whatever and a bunch of drovers kidnapped me because somebody paid drovers to kidnap me, take me to London, and then they just sort of dropped me off there and left. And, there's no reason for somebody to want to kidnap a serf. He's not a wealthy serf, and there's no reason for them to just take him to London and then just leave him there. Like, nothing to do with that. What it turns out, by the end of the book, is that particular plot, that particular thing, it did happen because the person who was doing that was using those drovers to kidnap Tom, and then so that when he returned to the village with his story that, no, I didn't run away, I got kidnapped, that it would set him up to seem untrustworthy and a little loopy, so that when the villain of this book, who is, I suppose, both a villain and a villain, that is, villain with an E-N at the end and villain with an A-N, that when this man murders the village reeve, that what would happen is that everybody would automatically blame Tom because Tom's lands had been handed over to the reeve following this ostensible running away. And so that what then happened was that what in theory would have happened was that this man would make it look like Tom had committed the murder, and he would have no leg to stand on because everybody's already primed to disbelieve everything that he says. And it's interesting because, of course, everybody in the village assumes that it's Tom, but Frevisse starts turning it over and says, let's step back for a moment and ask, what if Tom's weird story was true? And it's that clear-sightedness, that ability to step back for a moment and say, yeah, but what if? Let's look at this from another angle. And her ability to look at it from another angle, to turn it over in her head, it's one of the hallmarks of this series, of Frevisse thinking things over and over and over again and saying, what is the angle? Who else could have done this? Why would this person have done that? Like, just to keep turning it over and over and over. And there's this wonderful section in there about her constantly turning these thoughts over and over in her head as she figures out what actually happened. And it's a wonderful bit in there. Equally as wonderful, of course, is at the very end of this, where because Frevisse doesn't suffer fools gladly, because she is a nun definitively because she chose to be, because of a whole bunch of factors in who she is, sympathy is something that she often has to work at. Empathy is something that she has to work at sometimes for those who are not as smart as she is, who are not as devoted as she is, or any number of other things. You know, she's had difficulty empathizing with Sister Thomasine earlier in the books, because Sister Thomasine is somebody who was so devoted to becoming a nun and to all of that sort of thing that she is entirely incapable in some ways of functioning in the real world. And Frevisse looks at Sister Thomasine and has difficulty really clicking with that, because she looks at it and says, am I a bad nun that I can't think, oh, well, how could anybody want anything but God? That she can understand how people might want something else. And she has trouble empathizing with Thomasine's devotion, because while Frevisse is very, very devoted, something that comes through once again in spades in this book, she also has trouble empathizing with anybody who is, not sufficiently grounded. So that's always something that she struggles with. And you get to the final bit of this book, and Tom, the man who had been kidnapped and then been framed for a murder, who, he had done something that was illegal in effect at the start of this book, but it wasn't like morally reprehensible. He and a cousin had basically sort of done some trading back and forth between them, and his cousin would, have the benefit of somebody doing his work for him, and Tom would get the benefit of a large amount of money coming in because he wants, stuff. And so it wasn't like there was anything morally reprehensible. It was just that it was kind of, a legal workaround on things. And it was an illegal workaround, rather. But, he was certainly not somebody who was going to murder anybody, and, he had basically been framed and set up very, very badly. And he comes to Frevisse at the end with effectively a stitched nightcap that his mother and sister had made, and he offers it to Frevisse sort of as a thank you, saying, we tried to make this just a plain thing with, just some decorations to show the effort as a thank you, and Frevisse thanks him for it and takes him and assures him it's appropriate, even though the embroidery on it makes it not wholly appropriate for a nun. But she takes it anyways and decides to keep it because she wants to remind herself that in her position as prioress, she is not merely in charge of the nuns at the priory, she is also running the nunnery's lands, the priory's lands. And that means that the serfs that are beholden to the priory are also people that she owes her attention and, in a lot of ways, her noblesse oblige to. And so, she takes that to remind herself of that, and it in turn reminds her that when a cat settles on her lap that has sort of been hanging around, she was going to sort of pitch it off and just sort of drop it on the ground because she had to get back to whichever round of prayers it is, nonus or something. And she reminds herself that one of the dictates of it within the Bible is a reminder that you need to treat all things, great and small, with kindness, and thinks to carefully pick the cat up and leave it on the warm spot on the cushion where she'd been sitting. And it is a final note, because it is the final note, that is ultimately very much about Frevisse, who is a very, very good person, who is not lacking in empathy, but has difficulty finding empathy for people who say or do things that she finds irritating or appalling or any number of other things, and her taking this moment to remind herself that things other than the people and ideas and concepts she personally values, that these other things also have value. And it's a wonderful closing moment. It's a wonderful moment of that's very, very Frevisse in a particularly dominant way, that we have her resolving mysteries throughout this series. We have her being incredibly difficult and salty about people who are being idiots around her. You have her frequently sharp sense of humor. You have her pragmatism. You have all of those things. You have her devotion to God, but through it all you have her constant efforts to remind herself to have sympathy for people, to not judge people just because you personally don't like them, to always be careful of others. And it's fundamental to her character that she has this fine-honed awareness of her flaws and a fine-honed determination to overcome them. And it is one of the things that makes her so very appealing as a protagonist, is that you have that sharpness, but at the same time you have her being able to step back and say, I am aggravated by this, but I need to remember that this is a person who deserves my empathy and sympathy for being a fellow human being. That she violently disliked Master Montfort, Maurice Montfort, but when he died, she pushed herself through to try to find his murderer, even though she didn't really care. And she pushes herself to find that empathy and to remind herself of that empathy in the final bit of this book. And I think it's a great note for the series to go out on, and I think that's all I've got to say, so I will see you all next week.